Welcome to Shaped by Faith with your host, Theresa Rowe. To find out more about Shaped by Faith and Theresa Rowe, please visit shapedbyfaith.com or visit the YouTube channel, Facebook, or Instagram. And now, here is Theresa Rowe.
Welcome to Shaped by Faith, where we shape our bodies and hearts for God's purposes. My guest today is Kelly Irvin. She is the best-selling author of over 30 books and novellas, including Amish romance, romantic suspense, and an upcoming women's fiction title. Her latest Amish romance novel, The Heart's Bidding, is the first book in a new series, Amish Calling, set in Virginia. She has published 7 romantic suspense novels, including recently released A Deadly Wilderness and No Child of Mine. This award-winning novelist worked as a newspaper reporter before spending more than 20 years in public relations. Kelly now writes fiction full-time, and she lives with her husband, photographer Tim Irvin, in San Antonio, Texas, and they are the parents of 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and 2 honorary cats. Welcome to Shaped by Faith, Kelly.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we started today, I was asking you about your weather there, and you said it's hot, right?
Oh my gosh, triple digits every day.
Oh, wow. Well,
Yeah.
so have you always lived in San Antonio?
No, actually, I'm a transplant from Kansas. I originally grew up in Abilene, Kansas,
Oh, yeah.
which is a really small rural community that is more well known for being the home of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Museum and Library Complex. So it's funny that such a funny juxtaposition of farmers and tourists to grow up in. But I was part of a working class family. My dad painted houses and things like that, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and there were 5 kids, and we just had that kind of small town upbringing where we walked to the library once a week to go to the story hour, and we walked to the pool to take swimming lessons, and had a garden in the backyard and played outside until it was dark, and just sort of the things that you think of in those days. Things were in some ways much simpler.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember we played outside till it was dark. Yes. We walked everywhere. We rode our bikes, and that's just the way it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I had very conservative, very protective parents, so probably not as much for us as it was for a lot of kids. But growing up at a time when we walked to school and we walked everywhere. My mom would send us to the grocery store to buy pop, as we called it, and nobody thought anything of it in a small town like that. And there's a lot of pluses to that for sure.
Absolutely. Our grandchildren, we have grandchildren as well, and they don't do a lot of that, like we did. And of course, the world's a different world from what it used to be.
And I have grandchildren that are. It is. It's a lot. Kids' lives are much more organized than they used to be.
Yes, so much more activities. What did you aspire to be when you grew up? Did you have these dreams and aspirations of being an author when you were a child?
I did. I always wanted to be a writer. I like to tell people that my older sister was 12 months older than me, and I had our first little newspaper. I think we were in first grade or second grade. I always kept a journal, and as I got a little bit older, I wrote poems and plays and things like that. I always thought that I would be a writer. I love to read. I think that had a lot to do with it. I was an avid reader, and I went to the library and checked out as many books as I could and carted them all home, throughout the year, and just never was anywhere without a book. And I think that lent itself to wanting to write fiction. I wanted to be able to do that. I was just fascinated with it.
Well, you were in training too. I mean,
Yeah,
reading
exactly.
books and yes, and being surrounded by those. I think it makes a huge difference in someone's life. So, okay, you were a newspaper reporter. That's fascinating. So, what led to that job?
As I mentioned, I grew up in a working class family, and I was very practical about the fact that I wanted to be able to support myself. We lived on a very, very small budget for a family of seven, and it was tough. We got our clothes at garage sales in the Salvation Army, and my mom did her best to feed us and get everything that we needed on a very small working class man's salary. And so I was very cognizant of money and how important hard work was. And I just wasn't sure that I could make a living as a novelist. So I said, well, I want to write for a living. And so I decided in high school, I worked on the newspaper, the high school newspaper and the yearbook. Went to some writing contests at the University of Kansas that they had for high school students. And I decided that I wanted to go there to the University of Kansas and get a degree in journalism. I was one of the first in my family to get a college education, and got a degree from the William Allen White School of Journalism.
Oh, wow.
And was, threw myself into the world of reporting. What I found out, though, was that I'm pretty much an introvert. I am an introvert. And so it was very difficult for me to do the interviews and to make the phone calls and to insert myself into people's lives to get the stories. I loved writing the stories. And it's with my experience in the 10 years that I was a reporter, that it was usually the reverse. There were many reporters who loved going out there and getting the story, especially investigative reporters, but then they really struggled to write them. Whereas me, I just thoroughly enjoyed writing the stories. But I became a reporter so that I could be sure that I could have a salary. It was amazing how poorly reporters were paid. This was, of course, the early 80s, but my first job, I think I made $240 a week.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was just barely enough to get by. And so it was never, but my thought was, well, I'm making my own money. I can make my own way, and I'll work my way up. And with lots of twists and turns. It was the building blocks for me becoming a fiction writer, because much of what I learned as a reporter, I worked mostly on the Texas-Mexico border. In fact, I met my husband in El Paso. He worked for a TV news station there. And so that was the basis for a lot of what goes into my romantic suspense novels. What I learned as a reporter in covering stories along the border.
That is interesting. It's too bad that the investigative reporters couldn't go out, get the story, and bring it back to you.
Right.
Write it.
It would be hard, because I would have to basically interview them, because one of the things I found is I really, I would go and interview somebody, and then I had to come back and write that story right away while the interview was fresh in my mind. It's much harder to do from notes.
Exactly.
You can, obviously, but it's not as, it doesn't flow as easy as when you have all of that interaction with the person you interviewed still fresh in your mind.
That's right. And I think a lot of reporters now, from what my own experience with them, is they record you. So they have the whole conversation, and that's kind of nice, that they can go back.
Well, and I think it cuts down on misquoting too. You've got that there, and you can check your work when you have it recorded like that. And if there's any question about whether they said something, you have that record of it.
That's true. And you also have the record of, I've been interviewed before, and I've said things, and I'm like, oh, I really didn't mean it like that.
Yeah.
I'm like,
but sometimes things get taken out
careful.
of context too.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. So everyone stay tuned for more Shaped by Faith. Welcome back to Shaped by Faith. My guest is Kelly Irvin. She's the best-selling author of over 30 books. She is Amish romance novels, The Heart's Bidding, and then it's set Amish Calling, set in Virginia. And she's published 7 romantic suspense novels. I mean, she's published a lot, and we're going to talk about those books today. But before that, Kelly, I want to ask you, when did you begin actually writing books? I know you were a reporter, and then we really didn't talk about your career in public relations. We can always circle back around, but when was your first published work?
It really comes out of that. I spent 20 years in public relations with the San Antonio Parks and Recreation Department, and I got married and had 2 children, and I was working full time. But I woke up on my 45th birthday and said, you know what? If I don't write that novel now, I'm never going to have that chance. I want a chance for my dream to come true of being a published author. And so I started writing. I wrote early in the morning before I started work. I wrote in the evenings after the kids went to bed. I wrote on weekends, and I wrote that first book. And then I started that long road toward figuring out how to get it published. And I, of course, was very naive and thought that the first book that I wrote out of the gate was going to be the one that I published. But it really was that realization that life was passing me by, and this was my dream, and I better get my rear in gear and write it. So I did. So
what was your first published work? What was that called?
Well, by happenstance, it was actually the third book that I wrote. It was A Deadly Wilderness, which is one of the books that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Because it was published by a publishing house that its market was libraries, and so they published these quality library quality hardbacks, but the book did not come out in ebook or in paperback. It wasn't in bookstores. Basically, it was available to libraries, which was very exciting for me because I loved libraries, and it was the idea that people would be able to go and check my book out at the library was fantastic. But fast forward, to today, and I have published several romantic suspense novels with HarperCollins Christian Publishing, and I thought, this audience has never read this book, and the one that followed it, No Child of Mine. So I really want to have it to be accessible and affordable because hardbacks are so expensive. And so I had the opportunity with my agents. My agency has an imprint called Ally Press, and they brought the books out in ebook and in print, so that now that it's available online to readers who've been reading my other books.
Okay. Well, we're going to definitely talk about that. And, your writing style covers a wide variety of genres. So, because a lot of authors will stay in one lane, but you cross over quite a bit on that highway. So what is your approach to writing in all the different genres?
It's difficult for writers to be able to change those lanes and genres. I'm very fortunate that I have a publisher that's willing to allow me to explore that. And what really brings them together is the fact that they all involve women who are strong and have stories to tell. But they are different in the sense that Amish romance is Amish. That's a very defined world with very defined parameters for the stories in terms of their lifestyles and how strongly their faith plays a role in the way they live their lives. And it just results in some really beautiful stories, I think. With romantic suspense, those come more out of my background as a journalist, some time I spent doing proofreading of court transcripts for court reporters gave me a lot of fodder for how to set up the romantic suspense stories and do crime scenes and investigations and things like that. And then we have women's fiction, and that I think we'll talk about the fact that that comes out of my situation in terms of my health. And those books are written, that particular book is written in first person, which is very different from the third person point of view that you find in the other two books.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you prefer one genre over the other?
No, they all have their own challenges and in some ways their own rewards. But what I have found that's really helpful to me is that writing in the different genres keeps me fresh. It's very difficult. I've written, I think, about over 20 of those books that I've written are Amish romances. And as I said, that's a very small world because they have very limited numbers of occupations and things that they find acceptable to do in terms of their faith. And so, it's difficult to come up with fresh storylines. And just romantic suspense gives you the opportunity to write some really nasty villains and to really explore a completely different world that is just very gritty. Whereas women's fiction just allows you to explore those family dynamics that can be very difficult, and that for me is very rewarding. So having the three of them be very different is actually very helpful to me as a writer.
And like you said, it keeps you fresh on your toes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do you draw your inspiration when writing? Because writing obviously is a gifting from the Lord, and I know it comes from Him. But is there anything you do in particular, or do these stories just God just give you these creative ideas to write these stories?
I absolutely think that it's a vehicle for Him to have the stories written and told that readers need to hear, that they need to read, that they need to be able to see the truth of His word brought home to them through stories. I mean, Jesus told parables because that was the easiest way for people to understand what the points that He was trying to make. And I don't think that there's any way that these stories would have just that I would have just been able to think them up without some inspiration that comes from studying the Bible and being in fellowship with other Christians. But a lot of it comes from life experience and everything that's happened to me through all of the years that I've dealt with health issues and difficulties, family difficulties, and just so much of that, at the time you're thinking, God, why is this happening? But now I can look back and say, well, you had a plan that this is how I can use this to tell stories that people who've been through similar trials and difficulties can relate to, and that they can learn the lesson that you are trying to teach us through these stories.
You mentioned your health, and so I know you have stage 4 ovarian cancer. When did you find out you had that?
In January of 2016. So it's been, 8 years, almost 8 years, I guess. Well, it is 8 years, isn't it?
Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's funny because, that used to be like just I would be able to tell you exactly because the lifespan of women who have stage 4 ovarian cancer is usually 5 years. And so every year I would say, well, I'm still here. And so many women don't get that opportunity. And I was talking with my Sunday school class about this recently. We were talking about the difference between miracles and God's providence. And I just feel like He still had work for me to do. And so there have been opportunities for me to receive treatments. I'm going to a clinical trial clinic now that has phase 1 clinical trials, and I'm in one of those, and it's been working, which, it's just something that it's such a blessing to have that opportunity and have this clinic just be 30 minutes from where I live. So
Yes.
that tells me, that I have, God is directing this and giving me the opportunity to write and tell these stories, and that having this disease is part of that story.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, Kelly. We're going to take a real quick break. We'll be back with more Shaped by Faith. Welcome back to Shaped by Faith. Kelly Irvin is my guest, and she's a best-selling author. And let's get into your books now, Kelly. The Heart's Bidding, Amish romance novel. Okay, so tell us about it.
The Heart's Bidding is the first book in a 3-book series set in Virginia that features a family of auctioneers. And auctioneering is something that the Amish do. They have a lot of auctions as fundraisers for their schools and for different projects that they have going on. And so I wanted to explore that and have some fun with that. But also the heroine of the story is the teacher who teaches children with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And I wanted to explore how the Amish, what their philosophy is, because it's really beautiful for their children who, and this can be a hot button issue with people with disabilities, which includes myself, because I have mobility issues. They call them their special children, and they love them. And they want them to have everything that the other children do, but they treat them with particular love and affection in a way that is just really beautiful, and very different sometimes from what we see in the mainstream world. And so this is a story about these two, this auctioneer and this teacher, and how important their careers are to them, and how they have to find a way to allow romance and love to have room in their already full lives.
So to write Amish romance novels, you certainly have to know about them. So did you just grow up knowing about the Amish? Did you have to research? What did you do?
I do a ton of research. This was originally something that my agent, my first agent, who has since passed away, really wanted me to try, and so I did. And I did a tremendous amount of research, and I go to each Amish community that I write about, so that I have a sense of what's going on in that particular location. But there is just tons and tons out there that helps you to really get an understanding. Books, videos. It's just a topic that people are really interested in, so there's lots of information available.
Okay. So now you recently released 2 romantic suspense novels, A Deadly Wilderness and No Child of Mine. So tell us about those.
A Deadly Wilderness, as I mentioned earlier, was one of my earliest published books. And it is the story of a homicide detective who is out on a walk with 2 little boys. He's taking them on a hike, and he falls into a ravine and finds a body. And that sets the stage for his attempt to determine who this is and what's happened to him. But the critical part of the story, I think, is that this little boy that's with him is the son of the woman that Ray Johnson, this detective, loves and would really love to date, but she is not over the loss of her husband yet. And so that's the romantic suspense for me. It's really important that there be romance and that you care about the characters. And I love these 2 characters so much. They're so determined. He's so determined to love her, and she's so determined to not be loved by him. So it's it's a story that I loved writing because it has a really nasty villain in it, but it's also a wonderful love story. No Child of Mine is the story of an 8-year-old foster child who is abducted during a wedding reception. And while these 2 detectives who were part of the wedding group are looking for him on this ranch where he's disappeared from, they find the body of a little girl who has been murdered. And it's not the body, the bones, the skeletal remains. And so it becomes a cold case that they are trying to solve while they're trying to find this little boy. And so this story really allowed me to look at the cold case, but also to look at the state of the foster care system, which is not good in the state of Texas, and I from what I've heard in most states. And so that was sort of the starting point for No Child of Mine.
So as far as those 3 books you just told us about, where can we purchase those?
They're at any online bookseller.
Okay.
They're available at both in print and in ebook, anywhere that you can buy books online.
What is your hope and your desire for your readers?
When they close my books, regardless of the genre, I hope that they are still thinking about them, that some nugget stays with them that they hadn't thought about before, that whether it's in their faith journey or if it's about how they treat other people, issues in the world, whether it's foster care or the way we treat people with disabilities, that they are touched by these stories in a way that helps them, that has an impact on them as people. I want the stories to entertain them, but I also want them to be touched by them.
For someone listening today, Kelly, and they're wondering what their gifting is, and maybe they're not a writer, or they're not this or that, but we all know that God has gifted each person for his glory. So how would you encourage that person?
I think it's important to be open to God's calling. Sometimes he's telling us pretty clearly what he wants us to do, and we're just like, no, I'm not doing that. But I think praying about it and being talking about it with your fellow Christians, whoever you have that's your friend or your accountability partner, I think that's important. And being in Scripture, because sometimes Scripture will speak to you, a Scripture that you've passed by many times and read, and you didn't think anything of it. And then the next time you're like, oh, that was meant for me, wasn't it? So I think you have to be open to it, and you have to be willing to say, yes, God send me.
That's great advice. You've been a pleasure to speak with today. Thank you so much for telling us about your books. Absolutely. And thank you for listening. I'm Theresa Rowe. Everyone have a blessed day. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Shaped by Faith with Theresa Rowe. Remember to visit shapebyfaith.com to find out more about workouts, the TV show, podcasts, blogs, Shaped by Faith products, and much more.